morning and welcome to the Great Apes Summit in collaboration with the Wildlife Film Festival here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So I'm going to introduce you to our panel in a moment. Today's talk is about the extractive industries. So joining us is Barbara Vilas. She's a mining consultant with 20 years experience. Sitting next to Barbara is Chris Ranson from the Zoological Society of London. Next we have Ray Victorian, who's from the WCS, and at the end we have Andrew Seguya from the Wildlife Authority in Uganda. And they will be talking to you shortly. But first, I want to just have a brief overlook at the points that might be raised during this session. So the governance and management of our planet's natural resources are issues that affect us all. As the world's population continues to grow, so too does our demand for natural resources. It's estimated that by 2050, the global economy will increase by about 4 times its current level. Now, for mineral-rich developing countries, extractive industries can provide some benefit if they are managed sustainably. They can boost economic benefit. They can also reduce poverty better than traditional aid. But these sometimes come with environmental trade-offs. Great apes are found in just 2 continents. They're found in Africa and they're found in Asia. They're all listed as critically endangered or endangered, and their numbers are falling at an alarming rate. And with regards to their numbers, some of them are as few as a few hundred, like the cross gorilla species. Some of the populations range to tens of thousands. Great apes are found occurring naturally in forests, and forests cover just about under 1/3 of the land area on our planet. 1.6 billion people rely on forests for economic benefits. In the Amazon, for example, we've seen some of the worst devastation of deforestation. 17% of forests have disappeared. If we look at the Congo Basin, for example, this is home to the gorillas, the bonobos, and the chimpanzees. Only 10 to 15% of forests are actually protected under the bracket of national parks and also reserves. And in Southeast Asia, that figure is about 20% for the home of the orangutans. But just because an area is protected, it doesn't actually mean that it'll rule out illegal or corrupt practices. It also doesn't deter multi-billion-dollar industries from trying to muscle in. Now, great ape conservation is a highly complex issue. If you speak to any of the delegates in the room, I'm sure you'll all agree that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It just simply doesn't happen. Every site comes with its own bag of problems. On the western edge, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you have the Virungas National Park, and this is home to the mountain gorillas. Here is a pristine area of biodiversity, which falls under the UNESCO World Heritage Site. But unfortunately, it hasn't deterred companies from Europe and elsewhere pursuing oil extractive industry contracts. Now, if seismic testing and drilling and the laying of oil pipes is given the go-ahead, this is going to impact on the great ape species. It'll impact on wildlife and other biodiversity, but it'll also impact on the local communities. In that area, there's about 50,000 people who both benefit indirectly and directly from fishing within the park. So it really is important for extractive industries to engage with conservationists to find out what are the problems. There are concerns with these particular plans, which I understand are on hold at the moment because the government is working out an assessment program. But there are concerns that if this is given the go-ahead, we could have another Niger Delta on our hands. Now, most great apes don't live within protected areas. They tend to live sort of outside existing or planned protected areas. So mitigating any kind of impacts in these wider environments is absolutely crucial. Habitat alteration through human disturbance as a result of logging and other extractive industries can result in changes to their behavior and also their distribution. The extraction of valuable minerals from the earth, as well as non-renewable resources like gas, oil, and water, can all lead to habitat loss, and it can also lead to degradation. And these are direct impacts to great apes, they're threats. So you have trees that have to be removed, vegetation has to be stripped, then you have bulldozers that come in, excavators, there's noise, the use of chemicals, and these will all affect the great apes. These animals are today living in much smaller areas. Habitats are becoming smaller and smaller to the point where they're shrinking and they're becoming fragmented. And with more human mouths to feed, the population is growing. There is a pressure for agriculture to expand. And if we look at Southeast Asia, lots of agriculture over in Southeast Asia, you have crops that are now being planted, such as palm oil. Now, palm oil is a very lucrative, fast-growing crop. The landscape in Southeast Asia has dramatically altered, and the orangutans are paying the price. In fact, 92% of their populations in the wild have decreased, and the rising world demand for palm oil means that Malaysia and Indonesia now account for more than half of the world's plantations. That's 10 million hectares. Experts will say that once a forest is lost to agriculture, that it's usually gone forever, along with the animals and the plants that once lived there. Now, of course, there are sustainable forestry practices. I'm going to quote one here, the Global Forest and Trade Network, which was created by WWF. But are they a panacea? This particular organization claims to responsibly promote forest management, and it claims to have helped reduce the demand for products from illegal and controversial sources. But others argue that getting people to sign up to these sorts of organizations is arduous, it's lengthy, it's very difficult, and often they don't last. Industrial mining tends to be on a smaller scale than logging, but unfortunately it can be more severe, and it's concentrated in certain pockets. And then you have the indirect threats that come with this type of mining, and that's the development of infrastructure. So it means that workers come in, their families come in. That brings with it noise, pollution, disease, and then, as Annette mentioned earlier, you have the issue of hunting and poaching because of the demand for bushmeat. Then you have small-scale mining, which is often done by the poorest and the most marginalized in society. They're doing what they can to support their families. This kind of activity sometimes is uncontrolled, and it can very often lead to more exploitation in resources. Great apes are highly sensitive to change and disturbance. And the more interactions they have with human populations, the higher the risk of mortality. They have very slow reproductive rates. They don't just bounce back like other species. So we really need to protect their populations, because in the wild, if they start to decrease, they could face extinction. Damage to habitats is the crucial sort of turning point, really, that the extractive industries need to fully understand, because if they don't, the consequences can be enormous. Now, in 2010, the United Nations set up the 8 Millennium Development Goals. Now, this was an aspiration to try and achieve things like halving extreme poverty, to halting the way disease like malaria and HIV/AIDS spreads, and also to deliver primary education to all. Now, goal number 7 was to ensure environmental stability. And it says it was there to ensure effective conservation and management to reserve the loss of natural resources and significantly reduce biodiversity loss. 2015 is literally only round the corner, and we all have tough questions to ask about what is the extraction industry going to do in the future. The demands by the human population is not going to slow down, so is it any wonder that environmental protection is high on the agenda today? This morning we're asking, can extractive industries operate effectively without further endangering the survival of the great ape species? Thank you for listening. Now let's talk to Barbara Filas, who's going to talk about mining.
I feel like I'm the only industry representative in the room, probably, amongst a lot of conservationists, and so maybe I have that target on my chest. But I look forward to the dialogue. Some of the things, I was kind of expecting to hear things that were very anti-industry, anti-development in the opening session, and I pretty much agreed with everything everyone said when it came right down to it, because I liked what John Turner said about we have to look at the ecology, we have to look at the social and community issues, and we have to look at economic development. And I think that's what I've seen as a mining industry representative. I've spent much of my career writing environmental and social impact assessments for the mining industry. And with regard to great apes, I've done some significant projects in Sierra Leone, in Guinea, and in Cameroon, most recently in Cameroon. And what I've found is just the process by which the mining industry develops a project is where we kind of run into conflicts with the conservation community, because the steps of developing a mining project is a long and very expensive project. And it's fair to say this is true of oil and gas as well, but I don't have a lot of experience there, so I'll just stick to the mining topic. My experience has been that when I come in, when I've been asked as a consultant to come in and look at the environmental situation and do the baseline characterizations, it's at a time when the project is ready to be developed and feasibility studies are being done for actual development of the project. Well, the actual activity on the site started probably 5-10 years ago in the exploration phases, when only a very cursory environmental evaluation was done of those sites. Now, if I'm looking at impacts to water, impacts to air, those kinds of things, that's fairly straightforward that developing the project is going to be timely to do those studies in advance of full development of the project. With the Great Apes, though, the impacts to apes comes when people come into the area and start doing their exploration, when we cut pathways to be able to gain access, to do drilling and that sort of thing. And I found that whenever I've brought in the ape experts to assist with the impact evaluations and mitigation measures, it feels like it's too late. And if you go back and look at the industry side of that argument, early in the project, when you're looking at the basic exploration, the industry doesn't know whether they're going to want to develop a project. They're really just looking for the presence of economic mineralization. And during that period, until such time as they're ready to actually do a feasibility study, they've probably spent millions, if not tens of millions of dollars, of shareholder dollars, in making those investments. So doing the rigorous studies up front on shareholder money is a hard act to sell. Once you get to the point when it's time to develop these projects and do the feasibility study, then you figure out what you need to do for mitigation. And if it's millions of dollars in ape mitigation and you know, to protect habitat and that sort of thing, that needs to be factored into the feasibility study to determine whether or not the project's a viable project. So where we need to go is I personally think that I'd like to see if we can talk about some things about how we might be able to engage the conservationist community, the government community, the industry representatives in a dialogue before those mining concessions are issued. Because the mining industry hasn't come into the area, so you can't say, you mining company X, you need to pay for all of this. We need to come up with a way to get those initial screening studies done early on. The project I worked on in Cameroon was 30 kilometers from the Jaw biosphere. Yeah, we had a great ape habitat in our area, but the area that was withdrawn was 30 kilometers away. So the mining concession was issued. We proceeded with development of our exploration program, and by the time we were ready to do our work and brought in an IUCN panel as an expert panel to advise us on apes, it was already after the fact. So the industry needs education. We need to communicate with one another, because I will tell you, we speak very different languages. And when I got my report from my expert panel from the Great Ape Group of the IUCN, I felt like I had to write a rebuttal, because I felt like we had done everything we were asked to do, government had asked to do, and the normal process of development. But with the primate species, we're looking at a very different conservation method, that they're impacted much earlier in the project than pretty much all of the other environmental and social disciplines. So we need to come up with a way to anticipate the impact so that industry knows when they come in and do that early exploration what the cost is, and at least an assessment of what that cost might be by the time they're ready to develop the project. So it doesn't come as a big surprise that it might cost, I don't know, $3-5 million to do a real rigorous effort. We had a 250 square kilometer concession in Cameroon. So it was going to be a pretty significant effort to evaluate that whole area. So with that, I'll just leave that as my opening remarks, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
So I'm just going to discuss a little bit about great apes and extractive industry from the perspective of industrial logging sector, which is an area that ZSL have been working in Central Africa for a few years now. We've already heard protected areas, they are and should be the cornerstones of conservation efforts. However, when we're looking at great apes, for example, only between 10 and 15% of the great apes range within Central Africa is actually within protected areas, compared to 30 to 40% of their range, which is found in logging concessions. Forestry plays a major role in the economies of these countries, in developing countries, through revenues and employment. There's about 2 million people globally employed in the tropical timber sector. In Southeast Asia, about $20 billion annually goes into the economies of those countries from forestry sector. In the Congo Basin, it's about $1.8 billion. It sounds like a much smaller amount of money, but is actually a similar proportion in terms of GDP. Therefore, logging's here to stay. There's no point in us as conservationists just saying logging should stop. It's not going to stop. The reality is that we need to engage with the logging sector and see them as partners in conservation efforts, as opposed to the enemy and someone that we have to fight against. Justifiably, logging has been heavily criticised in the past for its impacts, whether it be through unregulated felling, or some people have even called it mining of trees, the damage from the extraction techniques, which open up the canopy, have a lot of collateral damage on the forests, opening up of new areas with roads, associated influx of people, the hunting we've heard about, deforestation, all of these things. So in recent years, however, we've seen a move towards more selective logging, reduced impact logging, and more recently, sustainable or responsible logging. So selective logging is where companies remove only a limited number of trees per hectare. Reduced impact logging is where they start to look at how they address some of their direct impacts, like by planning where roads would go in, making sure they're narrower, using directional felling to avoid some of the collateral damage to the forest. And then we come on to responsible or sustainable logging, which is achieved generally through voluntary certification standards, like the Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC. These standards impose specific ecological and social requirements from logging companies, which they must comply with in order to get this certification. Many of these go beyond the direct impacts of logging, but have to address some of the indirect impacts of logging. FSC is currently the global leading certification scheme, and it's the primary scheme being implemented in Central Africa. About 11 to 13% of concessions in Central Africa now have FSC certification. There's been a lot of research looking at the impacts of logging on biodiversity generally and great apes. It's quite hard to tease out exactly what's going on, but it's generally agreed that conventional logging has big negative impacts on biodiversity. However, sustainable logging can maintain viable or high levels of biodiversity and viable levels of great ape populations. For this reason, a number of conservation organisations and a lot of scientists have suggested that sustainable forest management is a way that we can get forestry concessions to actually contribute to the conservation of state and help us achieve the survival of great apes in the wild. However, the uptake is slow. 13% of the forests of the concessions in Central Africa is still a small amount. If uptake continues at the rate it's going to be a very, very, very long time before we see a big change in this. The main reason for this, and something that if we see this as a conservation objective and a way of achieving conservation that we're going to need to address, is the cost of certification. Many companies find these costs prohibitively high, which means they're unable to implement all of the actions which are required in order to achieve certification. And associated with that, the benefits that they would hope to get from certification are yet to be realized. The main benefits that people talk about are a price premium or increased market access. And as yet, these have still been very, very limited. There are also a number of challenges just associated with implementing certification standards to ensure that they have the benefits to biodiversity that we would want to see. I'll give one example through our experiences in Cameroon, but companies are supposed to control hunting within their concessions in order to achieve certification. Now, companies are not legally mandated to do law enforcement. That's the government agencies. So although the companies have to do it, it's not their responsibility legally. So we're seeing a situation where local administrations who need to do the law enforcement have slightly different agenda, maybe not the motivation to do the law enforcement. In some cases, actually are part of the problem. They're implicit within the poaching that's going on there. So there are many other challenges like that on how we can actually ensure that certification does have the benefits. And that's what we as conservationists working with the private sector need to start looking at how we can address.
I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and our mission talks about saving wildlife in wild places. And yes, we do work with extractive industry. So is that a contradiction? Well, probably in 2007 when we started thinking about doing it, it may have been. But I think Annette used the C word, consumption. Consumption is growing around the world. And businesses respond to consumption. And I was talking to a friend of mine, getting a little feedback there, am I too close? I was talking to a friend of mine who worked for a bank, and he had a research staff, and I asked him about this growth in consumption and how is investment responding. So he did a little study. And that study was really interesting because he looked at oil and gas, he looked at mining, he looked at forestry, he looked at agriculture, upstream and downstream. And they said between 2009, 2010, and 2030, the expectation was that investment would reach about $30 trillion. That's a lot of money. And I was thinking, if there's really going to be $30 trillion worth of investment, and we're working in wild places, we're going to have a lot of visitors. And those visitors are going to be looking for mineral resources. And those visitors are going to be working in gorilla habitat. So we had to figure out how to engage, and it's not necessarily easy, but we're moving in that direction, and we're trying to work with industry, and industry is interested. Not only is industry interested, I think there's a lot of interest in the banking sector right now. There are new banking rules that are coming out that are helping to promote best practice. And in fact, I'm going to show one slide. We're trying to keep this very minimalist on the PowerPoints, but it is only one slide. It's my art, no, actually. These are project impacts. We're going to talk about project impacts. What we're going to do is kind of displace all that space between those two lines here. And one of the processes in a good project would be from an early stage, and Barbara mentioned this, is to figure out how do we avoid. That is not a great ape. But the reason I wanted to show that is because in working with a mining company in Madagascar, the company decided, because of a particular habitat that was protecting that one little species, it was going to leave 20% of its ore in the ground. That's a significant economic decision, but also a decision in favor of conservation. And the company was really concerned about negative feedback from working in a place like Madagascar. You know, again, Annette, I'm picking on you a bit, but you mentioned these issues in that sense that there's a lot of pressure. These guys monitor their website daily to see if there's any kind of criticism. And so it was really important. The next step is to avoid feedback. The next step is to minimize these impacts. And that is, again, early in a planning stage. What design features can go into a project so that you're minimizing? When we were working with a mining company in Congo, we early on were able to determine the location of roads so that would directly minimize impacts to gorilla populations, and then have a greater linkage between the mining site and a proposed new protected area. The next step in this process is to restore. And restoration can be very important. I'm not an ecologist, I'm actually an economist, and my ecologist friends tell me restoration is quite difficult. But at the same time, it's very important because we're working in a lot of different areas where there's degradation, and if we can begin to put restoration in place, we're going to completely improve habitats that could be useful for great apes. So basically, as you see, if that little space between those two lines was impact, we have reduced impacts even before we've really get the projects underway. You know, the restoration is after the project, but you know, generally you can reduce quite a bit. So the next step is really offset. That is a level of compensation where you measure your losses and then you measure your gains and get some kind of balance which is called no net loss. Now, offsets have a bad name because oftentimes they've not been done well. And so there's a lot of criticism about them. However, if they're done well, they can actually lead to better conservation and actually get this no net loss ideal, or actually some kind of net positive impact, which is what many companies are now striving for, which are within regulations like the IFC Performance Standard 6. If we can get there, what does an offset mean? An offset means that private capital is investing in conservation measures, in conservation outcomes. I was working with one company who's pretty much committed to $1.5 million of investment per year in conservation to protect some new sites and to support existing sites. So new areas could come under conservation, there could be restoration, there could be support for those protected areas that Asha said, for example, that don't have sufficient financing. So the private sector becomes a partner in conservation. Conservation actions become part of the cost of doing business. And ultimately, we hope we would get to the protection of great apes throughout their range. Okay, companies alone can't do this. One of the things we really want to hope to move toward is some kind of national strategies where we have national conservation priorities, and then we have rules of the game where every company needs to follow these rules and follow this mitigation hierarchy, and then hopefully lead to better conservation results. Thank you.
Great. Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll look at it from the practical point of view as a manager of a protected area. I'll show some slides which will kind of give us a picture of what we're dealing with. And we'll say a bit of things from what Barbara said, Chris, and then Ray. Can I have some slides? I'm talking this from the experience of the extractive industry. We have the minerals which are being prospected in Bwindi and part of Ongahinga, which is quite a very, very protected area, but also oil and gas in the savanna parks. But let us look at what we might need to deal with. What we have in Uganda is that the oil blocks and the minerals, they are transposed on one of the most biodiversity areas in national parks, wildlife reserves, and forest reserves. And this is mainly in what is called the Albertine Graben, which is known to have one of the biggest biodiversities in the world. And in terms of oil, about 50% of all oil wells that have been explored so far are within these protected areas. And all the minerals, mainly iron, has actually been found in Bwindi, which is a UNESCO-listed area. Now, This is basically the area of the Albertine Graben, okay? And this is where all the oil, you can see all these are oil blocks, and they are right transposed right there. And this is Bwindi and Ngahinga, which have the mountain gorillas here. And this is what is going on in those areas. These are the different things which are going on, so I'll quickly run through them because of time. Those of you who can read, you can see what is happening there. But I want to go to the next slides. This is basically telling you how mining and oil is being transposed in the most pristine of the areas for conservation. Now, this is what we find, and all the pictures I'm going to show now are right inside the national parks. This is just a small team of people who are doing seismic studies. And you know that seismic studies involve sending explosions, little explosions that go right into the core of the earth, and then you get knowledge of whether oil is there. And we have about 100 to 200 teams in one of the national parks doing this on a daily basis. So you can see how the impact is concerned. Here is a picture of an early morning where all the oil trucks are now going into the park for exploration. And we have set rules that they have to give way to any other traffic, but you can still see the situation there, the impact. And this is a seismic study, which is doing noise and vibrations, and you know how much that one impacts on the animals. Now, waste management. These are drill cuttings on a very small area, and all this has to be taken care of and disposed of in a very good way. And what is that way is the question that continues to be asked. And these are drill waste consolidation pit. Now, this is about 2-3 days work, and you have companies exploring for years. This is the kind of waste management that is going on in the parks. Road kills continue on a big case. And you can see the land offtake, which needs to be done in order to create roads, to create yards, and to do exploration areas. Now, then you have to flare to see the quality of the oil and what needs to be done. You can see this is just one oil well being flared. Look at the oil which is being burnt and the fumes which are being sent out. And the infrastructure, you know, the beauty, what people want to come and explore. Now, this is one of the biggest slides that I want to show you. You see, this is a poverty map of Uganda. What you see in brown is actually the poorest of the areas. And if you look at this axis here, which I showed you, this is where the forests are, where you find the chimpanzees, and this is where you find the gorillas. And if you look, the brown area is also following that area. And that is something that we have to think about. When you have the most pristine of the areas, being the very same areas that the mining and exploration are taking place, and that the communities in those areas are the poorest of the poor, and that the countries in which that exploration is taking place are also very poor, then we need to ask a question. And Barbara's question was that, point was that we have to do a lot of this thinking and paying before, as we do the exploration, as we plan. Now the question that needs to be asked is, who is going to pay for this? You have a very poor country that needs its oil and minerals exploited. And to tell you the truth, many of the countries in Africa don't have a choice. The level of poverty is so bad that the presence of any sort of minerals or oil is like a ticket to some good life in the future. So they don't have a choice. Now, if you need tens of millions of dollars for you to do the basic work, who is going to pay for that?
And I'm going to stop you there, Andrew. Thank you very much to our panel. We are opening up the floor to questions. So if you do have a question, can you please tell me who you are, if you're affiliated to an organisation, and then who you want to pose the question to. And I'm going to actually kick off the questions because you're talking about who is going to pay for the extractive industries. I want to talk about corruption. In certain developing countries, obviously poverty is rife in rural areas, and many of the governments are, we've heard, have been taking backhanders in order to allow contracts to be sealed. So with extractive industries, how do we achieve this transparency when corruption is still so rife? Barbara.
My experience has been that, my colleagues in the mining industry refer to a lot of Africa as the banana republics because there is a lot of graft. We were trying to bring some humanitarian aid into the country as part of some of our community development initiatives, and literally a shipment full of medicines we were bringing into a rural part of Cameroon were held up for 6 months because the Port Authority was waiting for some money to be transferred. What I've seen with the industries, and I don't know the specific details of when it was formed, but the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is a push for the developing world to try to voluntarily demonstrate that they're willing to open up their books and show transparency on where their money is going for the extractive industries. Because, as has been said, the extractive industries are a huge economic engine for economic development in these where government's priorities are to reduce poverty and improve people's lives. So they're voluntarily trying to subscribe to initiatives like this EITI initiative, and there is a website, eiti.com or .org or something like that. And that way they can get certified, if you will, or approved for demonstrating that they're willing to be transparent about the monies that come in, which I think is a step in the right direction for attracting foreign investment. Now, you're always going to get people who are going to do things, you're going to get people who do things the wrong way and people who do things the right way. And I think by and large, I think as Chris has mentioned with the forestry industry and Andrew with the oil and gas industry, I think, most companies, the legitimate companies, want to do things right, and they're willing to put the investments into the mitigation, and maintaining that transparency is a huge plus if a country is willing to voluntarily subject itself to that kind of scrutiny.
Any questions?
My name is Jen Firestein. I work for Save the Chimps here in the U.S. and I've traveled in Uganda, and so I found your photos of the impacts to national parks very upsetting because I've been to those wonderful areas. And I guess my question is, as you say, 50% of oil and gas wells are being drilled in protected areas, what is the point of these national parks? I don't really understand why governments are allowing that level of exploration, that level of damage, and that level of invasiveness in national parks. Why is that being allowed, and why are industries even going into those areas?
Andrew, you work for the Ugandan Wildlife Authority. Why can't national parks just be off limits?
Yeah, it's one of those things which I addressed before, is we're in such a state where the governments are really in a difficult position with the kind of poverty and the populations they have, and they want to bring them to a certain level of development. The question is how, for so many years, agriculture has been tried and governments have failed to sell in the Western markets where products will get very good money, and a lot of other things. So people are looking at mining and extraction as the way. It's true that they do impact assessment studies, and this in exploration, usually there is a restoration and all that. But the issue is, I think, the balance between development and conservation is what needs to be looked at.
You talk about extreme poverty, but within the rural areas, sometimes the local populations don't benefit from any of these contracts.
Well, in Uganda, we haven't reached there because people are still on exploration stage. What will be important and what is currently going on in the law, the finance law, which is now in Parliament, actually communities have really come out to ask for their interests to be covered in this law. And both local governments, the kingdoms, and even us, we are saying that yes, if this exploration is to continue, then what comes out needs to be equitably divided between the different interests. And not just the government getting the oil, getting all the contracts, and the local people have nothing, because that has been a source of conflict in other areas, like in the Niger Delta.
Barbara.
I kind of beg to differ on the local people not getting any benefit, because most of the projects, or pretty much all of the projects that I've worked on, go out of their way to try to hire local people for the jobs for which they're qualified for. So, basically the unskilled labor jobs. We had a lot of the Baka pygmies in Cameroon hand digging trenches for us, and exploration trenches rather than using drill rigs, because it gave local
But is that
wages and
is that an
opportunities.
exception rather than the rule? Because again, there are lots of other examples of big companies coming in and they bring in their own workers because
Yeah.
it's cheaper, or because they've got contracts already in place.
I've seen some of that with, like the Chinese are pretty good at bringing in a raft of people, but my experience in the mining industry is pretty readily willing to preferentially hire local people. And when we write environmental impact assessment documents and commitments that turn into being the permitting documents, there is that commitment to the prioritizing hiring in the local area, secondarily prioritizing the regional area, and after that, people from other countries. And within it really is important to try to encourage that.
Ray.
I just wanted to respond to your point. I think you're right. I mean, it's looking at protected areas. We should be saying, no. I mean, these areas should be protected. I think Andrew's point about how do you balance that issue, it would seem to me that there probably need to be no-go areas that are decided that are so important. He mentioned potential iron ore in Bwindi National Park, which would be horrific, right? I mean, everyone should be working very hard to make sure that does not happen. In the protected areas, and like in Uganda, there was an effort at one point to limit that kind of development, but it was specifically allowed to go forward, and for the reasons I think that Andrew said so well. But I think then we need to, whether there's the banks, the governments, as NGOs who can put pressure on, to ensure that if there's any activity in those kinds of parks, like it's going on in Murchison and the other areas right now, that the highest standards are followed in terms of protection, and that there should be serious benefits going to conservation from those companies. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to balance it, because to say that Uganda will not develop its oil is not much of a non-starter for a conversation.
I gotta say, I completely agree with that. But my point about getting in there and excluding areas that are important early on, before it's open to mineral entry. You can't wait till a company has come in, put tens of millions of dollars into exploration, and then say, oh, by the way, you can't develop this. That's why we need to come up with a way of initially screening these areas. And I think many of you could probably draw a lot of lines on maps and say these are areas that you shouldn't go into. Somewhere there's a balance.
Chris, I want to ask you, as somebody who's worked extensively in Africa, do you think, I mean, Ray mentioned there that, sort of staying out of those parts is not ever going to happen. What's the kind of impact long term? I mean, do these apes have any future if we continue to invade their habitat at the rate that we are?
Yes, I think they do. I think I mentioned certified timber, for example. There are ways. Ray mentioned the highest possible environmental standards, and I think if we push for those and ensure that those are implemented, then there is a future. I do think the reality is that we are going to have to conserve great apes alongside economic development, and there are increasing tools out there of how we can manage areas better, how we can reduce impacts. The whole idea of offsets is a relatively new idea, I think. I'm not that familiar with it, but it's another sort of innovative approach, thinking outside the box, and that's what we're going to have to do if we are really going to achieve.
Yeah, but I think also the debate has to be stretched a little bit further, because we're talking about the mining companies and the African governments or governments who have the minerals. But how about the governments from which the big mining companies come from? Because you see, when they hit a well in Uganda, the stock exchange value of these companies goes up, their profits go up, and their taxes go up. How about those governments bringing back some of these to fund some of these initiatives, or even prevailing on the companies that come from their countries to make sure that they do the right thing where they have gone to explore? I think that one also needs to be stretched, because we're asking, where is the money going to come from? That could be another good source of money.
But how do you govern something like that?
Well, it's the debate that goes on. We need to find a way, because it is kind of unfair that the companies that put in private money go there and do the business. Somebody is sitting in a Western capital and he reaps all the profits from the taxes and the stock exchange gains and stuff, and he goes off scot-free. I think he should be part of the equation to make sure that all these benefits are coming to me, but I've got to give back.
But we have another problem, Andrew, and I don't disagree. But I've also been in situations where companies who were following lending rules, and I'm not saying Uganda at all, but I'm saying in certain situations where companies who are having to comply with certain high standards for lending have actually been asked, had their concessions canceled, and said, we want to give it to companies who don't worry about this kind of stuff, because the project will go a lot faster and there'll be more money for the country. We don't, rather than spending it on environmental. So we have both sides. So it's a really tough issue in the sense that we need to have the pressure and support from the developed countries, but we also have to build up the requirements and the standards in the countries where the exploitation is taking place, so that we have a common meeting space where everyone is following the same rules. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to come up with that.
You could also argue as well, though, that if, for example, you have governments who have responsibilities and have a conscience, that would slow down the process. And so if industries like Barbara's want to kind of speed things up because shareholders saying, what's happening to my money, they'll end up signing deals with countries like, for example, China, who may not have the same social and corporate responsibility as someone, let's say, if Britain got on the right side of things. So then you'll see like the shift in sort of those sorts of countries, exploring countries like Uganda and Asia.
I think that is true, and I think if you look at what is happening in most of the Great Lakes region, actually that's happening. Lots of Chinese companies are coming in hydro, electric, and other areas. But I think going forward, the way that it happened in the Western world, it hasn't always been that the most responsible companies rules came from here all the time.
No, sure.
It was developed. And I think it is our responsibility to see that we move east too, because China does business with the rest of the world. And so it's not that China and Southeast Asia are an island on their own, they can do what they want. So I think this is where we need to take the debate now, to see that we get everybody on board.
Another question? We've got the guy at the back here. I'll come to you. Yeah.
Hi, Sarah Sharif, Liverpool John Moores University. There's one aspect that I want to highlight that might be missing from the discussion, and that's with mitigating impact, whether it addresses the issue of the fact that it's illegal to kill apes in most, if not all, countries where they occur, and that although companies might not directly kill apes in their process, indirectly we all know that a large mining concession will lead to the death of certain individuals. And I'm just wondering how that then works with these companies doing these kind of things.
Ray, do you want to?
Well, no, it's a good question, and it's a challenging question. The process, again, done at an early stage in terms of the planning process, can help eliminate some of that, but it may not completely eliminate it, and I agree. And that is an issue. it's not a perfect tool, it's not a perfect mechanism. So, but I think that the effort would be, in a sense, if that's occurring, you know, what would be the conditions if we didn't put those best practices in place, and what would those be results, and how do we balance that? So I don't have an answer to say that by working with mining companies or working with extractive industry, that all populations would be saved, you know, that every individual. You know, we can't do that. How can we optimize our conservation, optimize the survival of these species is a huge question. I don't know if anyone else has.
I wish I had an answer too. I think it was well put. We do what we can to try to do as much mitigation as we can to limit the impacts. I think we can do a far better job by allying with, you know, Chris and I going arm in arm into the Cameroonian forest. Then, like I said, we often do that a little too late in the industry sector. What we do though is in the mining sector and most likely in the oil and gas sector, we are required to clean up after ourselves too. Almost literally every mining project I've worked on has had a reclamation plan that I think conservationists can definitely help me on. I'm a mining engineer. I don't know what kind of habitats or the lay of the land. If I have the opportunity with all my bulldozers out there, I can shape the land in a way. I can pick whatever kind of vegetation I want to revegetate with. So if it's better foraging for the great apes to attract them back into the area, those kind of things are happening today, and they can happen better. You know, it's standard practice and accepted in the forestry industry, but most people don't think about a sustainable mining practice as we reclaim after ourselves. But the industry does do that also. Can they do a better job? Absolutely. With
I don't know which one of you want to answer this, Barbara or Ray, really, but how would you feel, or how do you think industry would cope? Let's say you talk about early stages. So let's take it all the way back to the early stages where it's still in the boardroom, you haven't even decided whether you're going to do this. Do you think it's important to get people like Andrew and Chris into the boardroom immediately, regardless of whether there is going to be any minerals found or not, just to allow awareness? Because there are so many people within the extractive industries who don't have that awareness of the lay of the land, of how these animals behave, the disruption to their behaviour and displacement and the consequences. Do you think that should become mandatory?
I think it would be a plus. I think, you know, before...
And would it be well received as well?
Well, before a company even goes into an area, they need to, you know, they have to have an economic reason to go in. So it's got to be open to mineral entry. And I think the lady in the audience's comment about if these areas are that critical, we should not be open to mineral entry in the first place. And I think that's where the rub really lies, is establishing how you can get to the point where you say, this area we're going to preserve and keep industry out. But remember that it costs money to preserve habitat and apes. So the economic development can also provide a real plus for being able to provide the policing of the areas and reducing the bushmeat trade, because I can put a drought line around things, but it doesn't keep hunters out.
Sure.
So.
Okay, just to respond a little bit on that. You know, as I mentioned earlier, having those no-go areas, have some conservation planning, have a regional conservation plan, have some landscape planning. If a government's truly committed, and it is the government's decision to open up those areas, but if we can push for those, you know, and we have our responsibility as NGOs to help push for those decisions also. I think they're really important, that we can keep out those kind of interests, mining interests. That's really, really important. That's really a first step. Once the decision has gone forward to mine, there's going to be destruction. I mean, I've never seen a hole in the ground that didn't destroy the habitat. So that's one of the challenges that we really do have. And it's really frustrating, but at the same time, if we could figure out ways that it's done in the least destructive way possible, then I think we do have some hope. But that requires huge collaboration among companies, governments, NGOs, and others to push for that. And we're not there yet.
No, and again, we go back to palm oil because of this particular crop and because of the world demand. there are still companies who, you know, there is degraded habitat which can absolutely be used to plant this crop, but companies are still going in and clearing forests that are pristine primary forests. And, you know, they know this. So how do we make them, you know, what's the next step?
Wow. Well, I think, you know, it's interesting.
Sorry?
That's good, because, but it's interesting too that there's been a lot of concern that you know, you have a sustainable palm oil roundtable that has not been able to stop that from happening, has what I would consider very weak compensation rules, and has been really weak in its approach. And so if you have sustainability standards that don't promote sustainability, then we have a problem. We're going to be a little bit tougher on what we're requiring.
Okay, lady at the back here.
I just wanted to kind of shine a light on a different part of the equation, which is global consumers who have an enormous amount of power, and it's part of our responsibility, the people in this room, to educate consumers so that they can demand standards and transparency from companies, because the companies exist because of their consumers. So I think that's something we need to highlight and just not forget. Once consumers are aware of an issue, they can have a tremendous amount of power and create change. So.
I've got so dark I can't see. We'll go to the back there and then come to the front, please. Yeah, wave, it's easier, the light's so bright.
Thank you. Ian Redmond, I chair the Ape Alliance, and we have working groups that deal with a number of these issues. I wanted to pick up on what Serge and Chris were saying about law enforcement, because companies operating extractive industries, timber or palm oil, will say it's not their job to enforce the law, but they have a civic duty to report crime. And they seem to differentiate between crime. If one of their employees is robbing banks or selling sex slaves, they would probably be reported. But if they're breaking the law because of wildlife crime, it kind of doesn't matter. So companies can make a very big impact by saying wildlife crime, indeed any crime, is a sacking offence. And then any one of their employees who thinks, is it worth going out and buying illegal bushmeat or smuggling baby apes to get a bit of money on the side, they'll think, oh, but I know I'll lose my job if I'm caught. That can make a very big impact. And it's a very simple step to take. But it's that in the minds of many people, including, unfortunately, the law enforcement agencies and judiciaries in many of the countries, they don't regard wildlife crime as serious crime. But fortunately, in recent months, we've had Hillary Clinton, we've had the royal family in Britain, we've had various high-profile people saying wildlife crime is serious organized crime, it is destabilizing countries, the ivory trade is feeding armed militias and terrorists, and baby ape smuggling is among those things. So if they're going to start taking it seriously, then companies too have to say to their employees, sorry guys, we might have turned the blind eye to this in the past, but if you're found in this now, you are out. End of your employment. Then you'd have a really serious impact, not only on the deliberate, intentional destruction of ape habitat, because that's where the resources are, but that indirect and harder to control things that happens anyway.
So, okay, I'll pose two questions. Andrew, do you think that perhaps maybe governments should have more awareness and also impose harsher penalties for wildlife crime? And also, Barbara and Ray, do you think that perhaps companies should be fined as a result of that as well? Should also bear the cost?
Yeah, I think yes. What we're doing in Uganda is we're changing the Wildlife Act, because we've arrested so many people with ivory going out of the country, and a particular head of mission is right at the court when we are prosecuting the cases to get the people out. So we are changing the law, and we're putting very, very strict penalties which involve money as well as jail time. So I think that one needs to be done. We need to make it expensive for people to kill wildlife.
Not just expensive though, surely you also need to keep records, because again, in different parts of Africa, I know in Cameroon, when people are caught smuggling, let's say, baby chimps with bags of drugs or bags of arms,
yeah.
the offence for sort of arms and drug smuggling is obviously quite severe, but when they confiscate the baby chimp, it's a slap on the wrist and off you go, and he goes and does it again the next week, and there's no record that this is a repeat offender. So surely these records need to be updated, and people need to know that it's not acceptable, and yes, you will get fined in jail time, but we're watching you.
Yes, I think Kenya has started that, and we are following up in Uganda, where a database of these criminals is being created. There is the WAMS program, and also Interpol has come in, and our local police. And actually, they have opened up a website in Kenya. People should look at that. Everybody they arrest with contraband is actually posted on that website, which can be viewed around the world, and then governments can get that, that information. But also the companies, which, as he said, have these people within their workforce who are doing these things, should also face very big penalties. You can't imagine how far people can go. I actually arrested an ambulance coming out of an exploration area with the cops inside. An ambulance. And a big fine followed. And a lot, I think the company was deregistered. It was a contractor company. It wasn't the mining company. It was a contractor company. But this is how far we need to go. I agree with you. We need to make wildlife crime extremely expensive. But our problem is that out here in the East, these guys, even when they are known, somehow they go scot-free.
Would it pose another hurdle then to extractive industries if they too also had to share this burden? Do you think they'd think twice, or it's oil at the end of the day, it costs billions, you know, it's worth their while, surely?
I think you have to be careful. People kill animals. Companies don't. Okay, you know, so, and I guess you can take that many ways, but my point is, you know, if someone is caught with bushmeat in a vehicle, for example, the company, I was president of a company in Cameroon that had a strip mine that proposed, it's not developed yet. And our human resources manager, and this is management, he was found with bushmeat and he was immediately sacked. We had some other more junior employees who were also caught with bushmeat on occasion. They were also let go. People figure out very quickly that the high-paying job that they enjoy is no longer available to them if they're caught with bushmeat. So they do think twice. I think that, and the other thing is, this is a cultural thing. If we're trying to hire locally to give people locally the economic opportunity to work for our project, and they are doing what they would do on a regular day if they weren't employed by this company. You have to be careful about saying, oh, we're going to fine the company for an individual's behavior. I think you fine the company if they don't enforce their own bushmeat, anti-bushmeat initiatives within the company. If I would have said, well, my HR manager is hard to replace, so therefore I'm going to give him his slide, and we'll just let the guy that empties the trash cans, we can sack him because that's not going to make a big difference. I think that's when you really hit industry hard. But, you know, I think you insist on anti-bushmeat initiatives as part of the permitting process. I think that, at least in Cameroon, in Guinea, and Sierra Leone, where I've worked, those are areas where we committed right up front to anti-bushmeat initiatives and doing what we could to try to, and insisting that our staff didn't participate to the extent that you could control it.
Chris, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the more progressive companies do these things. The problem is the majority of the bad companies who aren't doing these things. And in that case, you need the government to be there pushing them, and the government actually doing their jobs. I'm concerned sometimes is that we do put all of the focus on the responsibilities of the companies, and we seem to often absolve the government of any duty whatsoever. And it shouldn't be that. The government needs to get on. But that comes back to your question of corruption.
Yeah.
How do we deal with that? Around where we work in Cameroon, government agents are involved in the illegal activities that go on there. Yeah. So it's not in their interests to actually enforce the laws. I don't have the solution for that. You started with the question about corruption. That's the million-dollar question, I think.
Yeah, fuels everything. I'll take another question.
Hi there. My name's Vanessa Bellowitz. I work at the BBC making wildlife shows. And excuse me for sounding naive. I'm I expect to sound very naive over the next few days, but I'm really intrigued because one of the things that doesn't seem to have been mentioned today is the timeline, because I think while it's really laudable that there clearly are progressive companies that are working with conservationists and trying to bring the process earlier and earlier, it seems to me that from what I've read about statistics about great apes as a survival is that we don't have time for that. And my question is, really to the NGOs in the room, is do you feel that, is there such a thing as a no-go area, which might have been 20 years ago, a no-go area could have afforded to be more flexible, but today maybe there is such a thing as a no-go area simply because we just don't have time. Are there kind of parameters that define a no-go area, and how effectively are your voices being heard if you are defining those and raising those with governments?
Chris, do you want to?
I think there have to be no-go areas. I don't think we can compromise 100%. You mentioned the Virunga example. Now, there is a lot of discussions going on amongst NGOs at the moment is with the line in the sand. Where do you draw that line? Where do you just say, no, we won't allow that to happen? It's tough because, as Andrew says, you're working in countries where, yeah, the need for development, the poverty and things. So, but I do feel that the NGO community do need to get together, as they are doing now, to agree and make that point and to fight that ground. It may be, unfortunately, that we're giving away a lot more ground than we would have wanted to. I think in an ideal world, none of us would want to see exploitation going on in protected areas. But these realities now, we've got to be pragmatic about what we do and fight for something. Fight a fight we can win.
Barbara.
But the other side of protected areas are, it costs money to protect an area. Leaving it alone doesn't exclude bushmeat hunters and that sort of thing. So being able to police the, government, as Andrew has very well pointed out, governments are usually not in a financial position to be able to provide the enforcement necessary. And that's where economic development is critically important, because if we see the economic development that can then be used to channeled into the right places, then it can be a win-win by working together.
But you have the argument also with the Virungas that you have the mountain gorillas, and they are probably a species of great ape that has actually seen an improvement in their numbers, and that's through ecotourism and not through mining oil.
And I'm, quite frankly, I was stunned at Annette's comments about the amount of work being done within excluded areas. I thought that's what they were, was excluded areas.
Andrew?
I think last time in the CITES conference in Bangkok, there was a case study, I think it was from Ecuador, where a protected area it has oil and everything, it was reserved, and I think conservation and everybody else had to put an equivalent amount of money to stop that being, I don't know, maybe someone can tell us, is that one way one can go?
Unfortunately, the president of Ecuador has decided that they're going to drill anyway, because they didn't get enough money.
So. He didn't get enough money. Well,
okay, so we'll take...
Who pays? That's the question.
There's a gentleman at the back and then a lady here. Okay, we're going there.
Hi, Dave Morgan from the Gulaga Triangle 8 project. My question is with regards to the forestry sector, and it relates to getting into those areas and before the fact, before exploitation takes place, identifying important areas, important habitats for apes. And we know most of the areas outside of protected parks and reserves have been mapped for their trees, and these resources are important to chimps and gorillas. The governments do it, and the companies that are working in those areas as well, they do it. They have these data. And there's only one company, and we're working with them, fortunately, that are interested in playing ball and giving up this data so we can analyze it and figure out what's happening in these forests, because logging takes place in very patchy distributions because of the spread of the trees. So it takes place over years and time in the place of even one chimpanzee community. But if we could get these companies to hand over these data, and I don't know exactly to who, there's no real organization except for maybe the Apes database based in Leipzig, to hand over these data so we can map out properly and understand exactly what is happening in these areas where NGOs aren't even working. There's no, most of these forests, people aren't working and studying the apes. But that type of data could really help out in trying to figure out what might be occurring in those areas. And it also relies on oil exploitation as well. Most of the oil exploitation in Northern Republic of Congo is taking place in those concessions as well. And so you have a lot of disturbance taking place in those areas. But if we could come together and before the fact and start assessing what is going to happen in those forests, I think it would be a good thing. It's a good starting point. And I'm just, we need to figure out how we're going to get these companies to hand over that data in a quick way. It already exists, and I'm not sure if it's a GRASP initiative or who's going to come forward to get other companies to buy into that.
Who wants to tackle that?
I don't have the answer there. I wonder, Dave, you've probably tried more than I, but I wonder whether going through ATIBT, some of these groups that group together associations of logging companies, working with them to see whether they can push their members to provide that sort of information. You may have tried that already, but there should be a way. I mean, it would seem logical that there would be a way. I don't know why they wouldn't want to provide that information. I suppose they'd be afraid of how else conservationists might use that information.
To look bad.
Yeah.
We know with first cuts, second rotations, if there's no poaching going on, for the most part, apes, as you mentioned, still exist in those areas. But yeah, if we come out and find with this data from this one company that it's really bad for apes, it's uncertain that they're going to want to keep on providing this data in those other areas. But I don't get that impression right now. And because most of the forests in Central Africa have only been exploited 1 or 2 times, there's still hope that there's some good information out there that we could get other companies to buy in. It's just, no NGO is really kind of coming forward and saying, okay, we're going to take this initiative and figure out how to get all of these companies to provide that data.
Right.
I think I was just going to say, I think if we come together as the NGO community, even ZSL and WCS, for example, who work with the sector and try and push from FSC, from ATIBT, we hopefully may be able to get somewhere.
Okay, another question?
I'm Alexandra Saunders, and I'm from the private sector, and I'm also an avid conservationist. I have a chocolate company, and I want to address FSC, the FSC certification, and also logging. Because I'm an avid conservationist, I'm just going to tell you my experience. When I started out my company, I knew that I needed to find packaging that was going to be biodegradable and also packaging that was compostable. And it took me an entire year as a consumer company to find a packager, a package company that would create FSC certified boxes. And so what I'm saying is that while there is this certification process in the forests, there's also the demand side. We're in San Francisco, and you would think that it would be easy for me as a company to find companies that would provide those kinds of materials. I was willing to pay a premium, but in fact, an entire year work. And after I leave the summit, I'm going to PAC Expo in Las Vegas to also search out some more material. It takes a lot of effort for a company who truly is concerned about the environment to do the right thing. And what I would like to see is somehow that the conservationists can come together with the private sector, especially the packaging industry, to educate them about the critical situation that's happening for the great apes, because if they don't, the packaging companies are going to continue to push products and paper from virgin rainforests, and you'll have companies that will not buy, they won't be able to be sustainable. My company is the only company in the United States that uses boxes that are made from FSC certified paper. That's how difficult it is, and there are thousands and thousands of chocolate companies. So that's what I think conservationists are faced with. That's the reality. So we can talk about consumer demand, but consumers are oblivious, and they cannot find the solutions.
So that sort of highlights there's obviously there's a loophole there, and it ties in with the woman's question up there, or sort of statement up there, which was about consumers being more aware. What can we do to raise this awareness?
There are a number of NGOs who are doing sort of these kind of activities. Actually, at the moment, it seems to be the big push is linked to palm oil, trying to promote sustainable palm oil and consumer awareness of that. It does feel a bit as if FSC certified products have dropped off the radar a little bit. Certainly, I even in the UK, don't see too much trying to promote those.
But even palm oil isn't always written on the back. I mean, you can check your products and it doesn't say palm oil, it'll be disguised as a different type of oil. So how do we change that? Because there are people who say, well, if it said palm oil, I wouldn't buy it. But that's the whole point. And the industries are doing that because they need to sell their products. So how do we make them, be more transparent and say, right, this is actually what it contains, so that consumers have more of a choice, and people like this lady can also resource things and decide that actually I don't want to go to this company because they're not as ethical as I thought they first were. So
I don't know if we want to start going off on palm oil, because it may be stealing the next session's thunder, and that's slightly difficult. So
rather than palm oil, just about
FSC. There are. You mentioned the WWF's GFTM. That is all about trying to promote both in producer countries, companies to produce or to go for certification, but within consumer countries trying to promote consumer awareness. So that's one of the main initiatives that I am aware of. But you quite rightly, it's definitely needed. That's one of the problems. That's with the uptake of certification around the world, is that the consumer demand isn't there. So we have to find a way to promote that demand. I was shocked that one of the companies we work with, all of their concessions are certified in Cameroon. I was shocked going around their timber yard when I saw piles of sawn timber with FSC stamp on it. Next to them, double the amount of piles of sawn timber without any stamp on it. And I asked them why, and they said they can't sell all their timber as FSC timber. There's not enough demand. Consumers aren't wanting FSC. And this is a relatively small company. If they can't all sell their timber as FSC certified, there's not. How do we get other companies to go in that direction?
Ian Singleton from the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program. I just got a couple of points that I noted down while I was listening to the comments, and I'm sure I won't deliver them very coherently, but I wanted to say them anyway. One is that I was really pleased to hear Annette's statement acknowledging that the vast majority of destruction in these countries is often traceable to non-range country companies, US companies, European companies, Australian companies. I was very interested to hear the comment about how the role of consumers, and I think consumers have a very big role now, and they're also in a unique position that they've never been in before, to be able to get on the internet, to investigate who these companies are, what they're doing, and quite importantly, who owns these companies, because I've actually skipped a point, so I'll go back one. One is that the onus of the companies is often on this one. It's like, oh yeah, we've invested $15 million on this, but nobody told us there were apes here. Well, surely the onus is on the destroyer of the habitat, not the person trying to protect it. And I think we have to expect the companies to be a bit more proactive in that. And the other thing is that a lot of these companies are very big companies, huge multinational companies. And generally, companies become that big because they are so good at hiding behind shell companies and slipping through loopholes in the law. And these are the experts. These are the guys that we're having to challenge. And I think we need to recognize that it's very easy for one company to go in and promise the earth and to protect the golden frogs in Madagascar and to set aside forests. And then as soon as they realize how expensive it's going to be, they sell it to another company and they buy a majority shareholding in that company so that they maximize their profits whilst minimizing their risks. And then they promise to protect the golden frog for as long as their concession, and their concession expires, and then they sell it to a Chinese mining company and they just trash the whole lot anyway. So what was the point of that? So I think we really have to understand how this sort of industry works. And then finally, on no-go areas, thanks for the time, yeah, most of these areas are no-go areas by law. National parks are protected by law, national law. Most areas, even non-conservation areas, but in Indonesia you have protection forests, which are protected by spatial planning law. And spatial planning law has rules against like altitude, slope, all these other critical factors. And they exist because people know that when you go in and break these regulations, hundreds of thousands of people get killed by flash floods and hundreds of millions of dollars of agriculture is lost every year. The problem is the people who make the money by destroying it are not the ones who pick up the bill. But I think we should acknowledge that no-go areas are already no-go areas by law. So we need the governments to step up to the table and take their responsibility.
That was a nasty dose of realism. Well, no, I can't really argue with what you say. One of the big challenges, as you say, is how do we get governments to step up to the plate? How do they say, okay, we're going to even respect the rules that we agree to? Now, for example, if a company, if we work out a really detailed arrangement where there's an area that's a no-go, let's say, that's really high priority for conservation, it's selected as an offset for a company that is doing something somewhere else, and it's going to be protected, and that money's put into a trust fund to be able to manage it, and then the government goes and ignores it and says, well, it was no-go, but actually we want to go in there. How do you confront that? These are huge challenges. We're trying to come up with some tools that can get us hopefully moving forward in the right direction. But every day we face those nasty realities, and we're trying to overcome some of those realities. It ain't easy, I can honestly say, and it's really frustrating. But as conservation organizations, we find ourselves having to engage in that, and it's hard. So I wake up sometimes feeling really optimistic about this sustainable future, and then you bring me those realities, and it's a bit of a downer, but we wake up the next day and say, okay, we'll keep pushing, and I think we can, and I look forward to that. I just wanted to also say, that Julie had mentioned this idea of consumption, and one of the things that Julie leads an organization called the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network, which is trying to come up with sort of mechanisms for certifying practices that are wildlife friendly in production, and to get at some of the supply chain issues and deal with consumer issues. Some of the companies are responding to some of these ideas and actually going and requesting to source materials and actually helping to stimulate better production. So that's another way to get at that too. Not just the consumer itself, but that intermediary, the company itself, that can help create demand for certain types of products, and we need more of that. So I applaud your efforts, and I do hope that we have more companies moving in that direction.
Great, thank you. Well, Andrew, Ray, Chris, and Barbara will be available for more discussions outside, but thank you very much for listening.
I want to also point out that we do have super no-go sites. They're called World Heritage Sites, and even those are being entered all the time by extractive industries and other industries. So clearly we need to do a better job enforcing what we have. I don't think we need to create new categories. A World Heritage Site should be quite enough, you'd think, and yet it's not. So thank you again for this first session. It went brilliantly. Well done.